October 14, 1943. 0947 hours. 27,000 feet above the German-Belgian border. Second Lieutenant William Lolly tightens his oxygen mask and scans the horizon through the nose glazing of his B-17. The air at this altitude burns cold enough to freeze saliva before it hits metal. Below, a carpet of grey cloud conceals occupied Europe. Above, contrails streak backward from 291 heavy bombers, the largest American daylight raid yet attempted without fighter escort deep into the Reich. Target: Schweinfurt. The ball-bearing plants. The factories that keep every German tank, aircraft, and U-boat moving. Destroy them, the theory goes, and you cripple the entire Nazi war machine within months. Lolly's headset crackles. Bogies. 11 o'clock high. Multiple contacts. The first Focke-Wulf 190 rolls into its attack dive 2 minutes later. Then another. Then 18 more. The sky doesn't just fill with enemy fighters. It becomes them. 6 months earlier, American air power doctrine rested on a single unshakable belief. The self-defending bomber formation could penetrate German airspace in daylight, strike precision targets, and return without prohibitive losses. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress embodied this philosophy in aluminum and firepower. 13.50 caliber machine guns. 4-ton bomb load. Service ceiling above 35,000 feet. Armor plating around crew positions. When arranged in a combat box formation, staggered layers of aircraft creating overlapping fields of fire, these bombers supposedly generated a moving flak barrage that no fighter could penetrate. The theory had survived contact with reality over France. Over the Ruhr Valley. Even the first Schweinfurt raid in August had validated the concept, albeit bloodily. 36 bombers lost. Acceptable, the planners decided, given the strategic value of the target. But August's raid had been a warning shot the planners chose not to hear. The Luftwaffe had committed only a fraction of its available fighters. Lessons had been learned on the German side. New tactics developed. New weapons deployed. Resources concentrated. And now, 2 months later, the Americans were returning to Schweinfurt along the exact same route, at the exact same altitude, targeting the exact same factories. The Germans had been waiting since dawn. The USAAF's 8th Air Force launched the mission from 17 bases across East Anglia beginning at 0630 hours. The 1st Bomb Division, 60 B-17s from the 1st Bombardment Wing, would lead. The 3rd Division, another 229 fortresses, would follow in 3 separate combat wings. No diversionary raids. No feints. A straight shot 460 miles into Germany, then 460 miles back. Fighter escort existed, but only in fragments. P-47 Thunderbolts could accompany the bombers to the German border, roughly 175 miles, before fuel limitations forced them home. A second relay of P-47s would meet the bombers on their return, again at the border. In between lay a 250-mile gap of naked sky. 2 hours and 40 minutes without friendly fighters. The planners called this the unescorted penetration phase. The Germans called it a kill box. The crews knew the odds before wheels left concrete. Ball turret gunners squeezed into their plexiglass spheres beneath the fuselage. Waist gunners test-fired their weapons into the English Channel. Bombardiers calibrated Norden sights while pilots trimmed controls for formation flying. Each aircraft carried 10 men. Each man carried his statistical probability. The 8th Air Force's loss rate had been climbing since summer. 6% in July. 8% in August. Every mission now crossed the threshold where, mathematically, aircrews wouldn't survive their required 25-mission tour. But strategic bombing doctrine demanded precision daylight attacks. The British bombed by night, scattering ordnance across entire cities. The Americans insisted on surgical strikes against vital industrial choke points. Ball bearings qualified as the ultimate choke point. Schweinfurt's 5 factories produced 52% of Germany's entire ball bearing output. Destroy those plants, and panzer production would halt within weeks. Aircraft output would crater. The entire Nazi war economy would seize like an engine without oil. This was the promise that sent 291 bombers toward Germany on a clear autumn morning. The formations crossed the Dutch coast at 1015 hours. Flak batteries opened fire immediately, black puffs of 88mm shells detonating at precise altitudes, calculated by German rangefinders tracking the Americans' course. The bombers didn't deviate. Evasive maneuvers broke formation integrity. Formation integrity meant survival. So they flew straight through the flak fields while shrapnel punched through aluminum skin and hydraulic lines. 1037 hours. The P-51 Escort reached its fuel limit and peeled away, waggling wings in farewell. Radio operators watched them go. Then they were alone. The Luftwaffe hit them 9 minutes later. Jägerschwader 1 initiated contact at 1046 hours, 18 Focke-Wulf 190s diving from 32,000 feet with the sun behind them. They ignored the textbook approach, climbing to attack from below, where bomber defenses concentrated. Instead, they came head-on, straight into the formation's nose. This was new. This was deliberate. The standard Luftwaffe tactic involved slashing attacks from the rear quarter, trading a few seconds of firing opportunity for survivability. Head-on attacks closed distance at 550 miles per hour, combined closure rate, leaving barely 2 seconds to aim, fire, and break away before collision. But those 2 seconds pointed German cannons at the B-17's most vulnerable section, the flight deck. The nose glazing. The spaces where pilots and navigators and bombardiers sat behind glass, not armor. The first fortress took 20mm cannon rounds through its cockpit at 1047 hours. The pilot died instantly. The co-pilot, wounded in 3 places, wrestled the controls as the bomber pitched forward into a dive. The aircraft fell through its own formation, forcing 2 squadrons to break formation to avoid collision. The gaps appeared. The order fractured. Then the rest of Jägerschwader 1 followed through the breach. German fighters hadn't appeared in 1s and 2s. They came in waves, JG-1, JG-11, JG-26, JG-300, over 300 fighters in total, stacked at different altitudes, coordinated by ground controllers tracking the American formations every turn. Me-109s and FW-190s pressing attacks from 12 o'clock high, 12 o'clock level, 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock. The disciplined geometry of the combat box dissolved into a 3-dimensional brawl at 400 miles per hour. Waist gunners fired until barrel jackets glowed red. Shell casings piled ankle-deep on cabin floors. Oxygen masks filled with vomit and blood. Wounded men stayed at their guns because an unmanned position meant a blind spot, and a blind spot meant death for everyone aboard. 1103 hours. Lieutenant Egon Mayer led his staffel through the formation center, his FW-190 carrying 2 underwing rocket tubes, Granite 21s. He fired both at 900 meters. The rockets weren't precision weapons. They didn't need to be. Proximity detonations scattered shrapnel across a 40-meter radius. A single rocket exploded 6 meters from the lead aircraft of the 305th Bomb Group. The blast shredded control cables and hydraulics. The pilot held formation for another 40 seconds before the aircraft rolled inverted and fell away. Streaming fuel fire, no parachutes emerged. Too low. Too fast. Too damaged. The bombers couldn't outrun their attackers. Couldn't outmaneuver them. Couldn't deviate from course without losing formation cohesion. And without cohesion, the defensive firepower that kept them alive evaporated. So they flew straight toward Schweinfurt, while the Luftwaffe rotated fresh fighter units into the battle every 12 minutes. German ground controllers had divided the route into segments, assigning specific Jägerschwader to each zone. When one unit exhausted ammunition, it withdrew to rearm while another took its place. The attacks never stopped. The pressure never eased. Every minute brought fresh tracers cutting through aluminum skin. T-1127 hours. The Germans introduced a new weapon. Twin-engine Me-110 heavy fighters approached from beyond the effective range of .50 caliber defensive fire, 1,200 meters, and launched Wurf rockets in salvos. The bombers had no counter. 12 rockets streaked toward the 381st Bomb Group's formation. 3 struck home. 1 B-17 disintegrated in midair. Another fell away with its entire tail section missing. The third continued flying for 6 minutes, trailing smoke, before the pilot gave the bailout order. 7 parachutes appeared. 3 did not. The math became unavoidable now. 28 bombers already down. 280 men. The target still 80 miles distant. Formation leaders recalculated fuel burn, ammunition expenditure, wounded crew ratios. Some B-17s already flew on 3 engines. Some with shattered nose sections, navigators dead at their stations. Some with turrets jammed, gunners bleeding out in the cramped ball positions where retrieval under fire was impossible. Still, they pressed on. Because turning back now meant the mission failed. Meant the losses meant nothing. Meant the Germans won T-1149 hours. Lead elements of the 1st Bomb Division reached Schweinfurt. The city appeared through broken clouds at 1,151 hours. A medieval cluster along the main river, church spires rising above half-timbered buildings, and on the eastern industrial fringe, 5 sprawling factory complexes. Kugelfischer, Fag, Fichtel and Sachs. VKF. The names meant nothing to the bombardiers lining up their Norden sights. The structures meant everything. Flak intensified immediately. Schweinfurt's defences had been reinforced since August. 48 88mm guns and 32 lighter 37mm batteries arranged in concentric rings around the ball bearing plants. The Germans knew the Americans would return. They'd prepared accordingly. Shells detonated in precise altitude brackets, creating corridors of shrapnel the bombers had to penetrate. Lead Bombardier Captain James McLaughlin centered his crosshairs on the Kugelfischer plant's machine shop. 40 seconds to release. Flak burst 6 meters off the port wing, punching jagged holes through the wing's trailing edge. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the bombardier's window. 30 seconds. The B-17 shuddered. Another flak burst, closer. 20 seconds. McLaughlin didn't look up, didn't flinch. His entire universe compressed into a gyroscope-stabilized optical sight and a factory building 27,000 feet below. 15 seconds. 10. Bombs away. 500-pound general-purpose bombs tumbled from the bay, falling in a precise geometric cluster. McLaughlin's aircraft lurched upward, suddenly 4,000 pounds lighter. Behind him, 63 more bombers from the 1st Division released their loads in sequence, each bombardier following the lead aircraft's drop. The bombs fell for 43 seconds, accelerating to terminal velocity, then struck. The first impact punched through the Kugelfischer machine shop's roof and detonated inside the assembly hall. Blast pressure blew out every window in a 200-meter radius. The second bomb struck the power plant. The third hit the storage annex where finished bearings awaited shipment. Sequential explosions rippled through the complex, ammunition for the factory's defensive guns igniting, fuel tanks rupturing, machine oil vaporizing into fireballs from 27,000 feet. The bombardiers saw secondary explosions, white-orange blooms expanding through smoke. Mission planners would later assess 80% of the ordnance fell within 1,000 feet of the aim point. By the standards of 1943 strategic bombing, this qualified as extraordinary accuracy. But accuracy came at a price measured in fractured formations and crippled aircraft. The bombing run required straight and level flight for 3 minutes. 3 minutes without evasive action while flak batteries tracked their course with methodical precision. German gunners didn't need direct hits. Proximity was sufficient. Shrapnel perforated fuel tanks. Severed control cables. Killed pilots mid-approach. 7 more B-17s fell during the bomb run itself, including the lead aircraft of the 379th Bomb Group. Its pilot, Major Robert Rosenthal, held formation through the entire approach despite fire in the No. 3 engine and half his rudder gone. He released his bombs, then gave the bailout order. The crew evacuated at 26,000 feet, except Rosenthal and his co-pilot, who stayed at the controls to keep the dying aircraft level long enough for the others to jump. When the last man cleared the waste hatch, Rosenthal finally released the yoke. The aircraft rolled inverted 3 seconds later. Both pilots rode it down. Neither parachute opened in time, WY 1,207 hours. All surviving bombers had dropped their ordnance and begun the turn for home. The Luftwaffe was waiting. German fighters had temporarily withdrawn during the flak barrage. Their own anti-aircraft fire made the airspace lethal to friend and enemy alike. But now, with the bombers turning west and formations loosened by battle damage, the fighters returned with fresh ammunition loads. The killing resumed immediately. The withdrawal became a running battle across 460 miles of hostile territory. The Germans focused on cripples, aircraft trailing smoke, flying alone, losing altitude. These stragglers couldn't maintain formation, couldn't concentrate defensive fire. Each became an isolated target for multiple fighters. T-1223 hours, AB-17 from the 303rd Bomb Group, 3 engines destroyed, tail gunner dead, pilot unconscious from oxygen deprivation, fell behind its group. 4 FW-190s swarmed it within 90 seconds. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant James Cronin, took manual control and pointed the bomber's nose down, diving for cloud cover at 14,000 feet. The fighters followed, firing continuously. Cronin made the clouds. The fighters didn't break off. They followed him through. The B-17 emerged below the cloud deck at 8,000 feet with 2 fighters still attached. Cronin dove again, pushing the damaged aircraft past structural limits, reaching 340 miles per hour in a screaming descent toward the German countryside. At 2,000 feet, he leveled out, too low for the fighters to dive further without overshooting. The Germans climbed away. Cronin flew the shattered bomber home at treetop level, navigating by rivers and roads, dodging flak towers, until he crossed into Belgium 3 hours later with 23 minutes of fuel remaining. Not every crew found such desperate solutions. The Luftwaffe killed 12 more bombers between Schweinfurt and the Belgian border. Parachutes dotted the sky over Franconia and Hessen, white canopies drifting toward capture or, occasionally, toward partisan networks that might spirit downed airmen back to England through occupied territory. Most became prisoners. Some didn't survive the descent. German civilians, bombed repeatedly by Allied aircraft, occasionally greeted parachuting airmen with pitchforks rather than mercy. At 1,318 hours, P-47 Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group met the returning bombers at the German-Belgian border. The relief flooded through every crew position. Friendly fighters overhead meant German attacks would cease. The escort shepherded them home across Belgium and the Channel, watching as damaged B-17s struggled to maintain altitude on failing engines. 18 bombers never made England. They ditched in the Channel or crashed on the French coast or simply ran out of fuel and fell from formation into the North Sea. Air-sea rescue launches recovered some crews. Others vanished into cold water without trace. The first returning B-17s touched down at their East Anglian bases at 1,445 hours. Ground crews ran toward the aircraft, then stopped. The bombers that had left that morning as pristine machines returned as shredded wrecks. Fuselages perforated by hundreds of bullet and shrapnel strikes. Wings with jagged holes large enough to climb through. Plexiglass turrets shattered. Tail sections barely attached. Blood on the cabin floors. Crew chiefs counted the missing aircraft. Then recounted, hoping they'd miscalculated. They hadn't. 60 bombers lost. 20% of the strike force. 600 men, killed, wounded, captured or missing. Another 17 aircraft damaged beyond economical repair, written off and scrapped. Total effective loss: 77 bombers. More than 1 in 4 aircraft that left England that morning would never fly another mission. Individual groups suffered catastrophic losses. The 305th Bomb Group dispatched 16 bombers. 6 returned. The 306th lost 10 of 19. The 351st, 13 of 19. Some squadrons ceased to exist as functional units. Not enough aircraft. Not enough surviving crews. Intelligence officers interviewed returning air crews through the night, reconstructing the battle from fragmentary observations. Gunners reported fighter attacks of unprecedented coordination and aggression. Navigators described flak more concentrated than anything encountered over the Ruhr. Bombardiers confirmed solid hits on primary targets, but couldn't assess long-term damage. Pilots simply stared at their coffee and said nothing useful. The 8th Air Force medical staff treated 594 casualties, wounds ranging from frostbite and oxygen deprivation to traumatic amputations and burns. Base hospitals overflowed. Surgeons worked through the night by lamplight, prioritizing the salvageable. Chaplains moved among the dying, offering what comfort doctrine allowed. In Washington, the loss reports arrived at the Pentagon by 2,100 hours local time. 60 confirmed losses. Perhaps more unaccounted for. The reaction split along predictable lines. Strategic bombing advocates emphasized the target damage. Post-strike reconnaissance would eventually confirm significant destruction of Schweinfurt's ball-bearing production capacity. Critics pointed to the loss ratio and declared daylight precision bombing a failed experiment. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, drafted a response emphasizing long-term strategic gains. But even his internal memos acknowledged the unsustainability. Another mission with similar losses would shatter crew morale and exhaust available bomber reserves. The Schweinfurt raid had demonstrated 2 irreconcilable facts. Unescorted daylight bombers could reach and destroy strategic targets, but the cost exceeded what the force could sustain operationally. In Germany, the Luftwaffe celebrated a decisive victory. Reichsmarschall Göring personally congratulated the fighter units involved, awarding decorations and promotions. German propaganda broadcasts announced the destruction of more than 100 American terror bombers, an exaggeration, but the genuine toll proved sufficient. For the first time since the combined bomber offensive began, the Luftwaffe had inflicted losses severe enough to force operational pause. But German analysts reviewing the battle drew darker conclusions. Yes, they'd bloodied the Americans badly. Yes, they'd proven day fighters could break up heavy bomber formations. But the cost: 7 fighters confirmed destroyed, 19 damaged, 12 pilots killed, represented an exchange ratio the Luftwaffe couldn't maintain. Germany produced fighters at a fixed rate, trained pilots at a slower rate still. America produced bombers in quantities that defied German comprehension and trained crews in assembly line efficiency. The mathematics were brutal. If the Americans could sustain 20% losses and return in greater numbers 2 weeks later, the Luftwaffe would eventually exhaust itself in a war of attrition it couldn't win. Every German pilot knew this intellectually. None wanted to admit it operationally. Schweinfurt's ball bearing plants burned for 3 days. German damage assessment teams catalogued the destruction by October 18. 67% of Kugelfischer's production capacity destroyed or damaged. 42% at FAG. 35% at Fichtel and Sachs. Total ball bearing output dropped 38% in November compared to September's baseline. But the Germans didn't collapse. Emergency measures dispersed remaining production to satellite facilities across the Reich. Existing stockpiles, larger than Allied intelligence estimated, covered immediate shortfalls. Swedish imports, previously minimal, expanded to fill gaps. Within 8 weeks, total ball bearing availability recovered to 85% of pre-raid levels. By February 1944, production exceeded August 1943 output. The strategic bombing theory, that destroying a single choke point would cripple the entire German war economy, had been tested and found incomplete. Industrial systems proved more resilient, more adaptable than the models predicted. The Germans simply rerouted production, accepted inefficiencies, and continued manufacturing tanks and aircraft. Not at optimal capacity, true, but sufficient capacity to sustain the Wehrmacht through another year of war. The 8th Air Force absorbed the lessons slowly, reluctantly. Deep penetration raids into Germany without escort weren't suspended. The strategic requirements remained, but their frequency decreased. October's missions targeted occupied territories within P-47 range. November brought weather that grounded strategic bombing entirely. December continued the operational pause while planners reassessed doctrine. The recalibration centered on a single variable: fighter escort range. The P-47 Thunderbolt couldn't reach Germany's interior and return. The P-38 Lightning possessed the range but lacked performance at high altitude. What the 8th Air Force needed was a fighter combining the P-47's combat capability with a range to escort bombers to Berlin and back. That aircraft existed. It was already entering production in California. It would arrive in England in December. Its name was Mustang. The P-51B Mustang reached operational squadrons in early 1944. With external drop tanks, it possessed the range to escort bombers throughout Germany and into Poland. Performance matched or exceeded the FW-190 and Me-109 at all altitudes. Production ramped to scale, hundreds per month, then thousands. When the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt on February 24, 1944, Mustangs escorted them all the way to target and back. The Luftwaffe contested the raid, lost 41 fighters without breaking up the formations. The bombers lost 11 aircraft, an acceptable loss ratio by any operational standard. The strategic bombing campaign didn't end at Schweinfurt. It escalated. Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, Ploesti. Every major German city and industrial center systematically targeted through 1944 and into 1945. But the missions occurred under fighter escort, with acceptable loss ratios, and against a Luftwaffe increasingly unable to contest Allied air superiority. October 14, 1943, marked the inflection point. The day the theory broke against reality. The day losses exceeded what doctrine could justify. The day the 8th Air Force learned that courage, precision, and strategic vision weren't sufficient without the tactical means to survive the execution. The 60 bombers lost that day took 600 men with them. Some died in flaming aircraft over Germany. Some froze to death in the North Sea. Some spent the remainder of the war in Stalag Luft prison camps. Some came home and never spoke of it again. Their sacrifice didn't cripple the German war machine. The ball-bearing plants rebuilt. The Wehrmacht continued fighting for another 18 months. But the raid forced a doctrinal evolution that eventually won the air war. Escort fighters, operational sustainability, attrition warfare waged with industrial mathematics on the Allied side. By war's end, the 8th Air Force had flown 1,442 missions, dropped 692,918 tons of ordnance, and lost 4,754 bombers. Schweinfurt represented less than 2% of those losses. But it represented the moment when American air power confronted its own vulnerability and chose adaptation over ideology. The men who flew that mission didn't see the strategic outcome. They saw fire and shrapnel and friends falling through 27,000 feet of cold air. They came home or didn't. They flew again or broke. They survived the war or became names on memorial walls in English villages. History remembers Schweinfurt as a tactical defeat and strategic learning moment. The men who flew it remember something simpler: the longest day.